We have with us this morning Mr. Clyde Bellecourt, who is the Executive Director of the American Indian Movement. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce him to you, Mr. Bellecourt. After he speaks, we'll have a few questions.
Thank you. I got a lot of paper here, but I haven't got any speech, written or anything. I've never written a speech in my life. I did agree I accepted the convocation this morning, and I mentioned over the phone that the topic of my talk here this morning would be Custer Died for Your Sins, and it was kind of a joke when I told them that, and I guess they set it up that way. My name is Clyde Bellecourt. I am Chippewa. I'm from the White Earth Indian Reservation, originally here in the state of Minnesota. I'm a member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, Mississippi band of the Ojibwa Nation here in Minnesota. It's quite a large area, when you get into the area of Indian affairs to cover in 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or even a year. I'm going to try my best this morning to talk a little bit about three basic problems that Indian people have today, or three of the worst problems that we feel as Indian people have. I'm going to talk in the area of Christianity, education, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These are the things that we are trying to straighten out as a movement in this country today. I'm a little down this morning. I just read in a morning paper where a federal judge by the name of Mr. Nichols from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, handling the Naval Air Station takeover, the assault charges that came out on a federal officer. He refused to cite or use any of the treaties to show the legality of our being there when we took over the Naval Air Station on May 18th of past year. So the trial is, we see again that justice is not going to be served to the Indian American because of the violations of the treaties and judges unwilling or unable or uneducated enough to use these treaties in court hearings. I was out at Bloomington last night. I didn't know that Bloomington still had a Human Rights Commission, but I guess all the suburban communities have one today. And my purpose for being out there, of course, was to discuss and dialogue a play that they had out there about 3 weeks ago that the American Indian Movement did disrupt. Several things happened about a month ago. We knocked off digging over here in Welch, Minnesota. They were digging into our graves again, and we stopped the Aquatennial and demanded that they excluded certain floats and marching units from that festival that they have every year because they don't want to sponsor Indian groups and haven't sponsored Indian groups for something like 6 years now in the Aquatennial. At the same time that these things were happening, the American Indian Movement found out through a student at Oak Grove Junior High in Bloomington that they were running a play out there, kind of a skit, summer play that was called Another Redskin Bit the Dust. And they couldn't understand why Indian people came out there and stopped that play. The American Indian Movement, of course, was formed in July of 1968. I am the executive director of AIM. I also serve on the President's National Indian Task Force. This is the only all-Indian task force ever put together by any administration here in America to look deeply into the problems that Indian people are confronted with every day of their life and to try to come up with some type of solution to them. Prior to the formation of the American Indian Movement, we did know that the stats that came up out of this survey and study that Indian people took, we did know that these things existed. We knew prior to the formation of the American Indian Movement that Indian people, as far as poverty is concerned, were right at the bottom of the ladder. Most poverty-stricken group or minority group in America today and probably in the world. Most people don't know that some of the conditions that do exist. I talk quite a bit throughout the United States in colleges, universities, churches, and etc. And it's unbelievable some of the questions that are asked and after giving such a talk. Generally it's questions like, do Indian people still live in teepees and Do you still hunt buffalo, and etc. And this comes, generally from teachers. So we know that there's not too much known about Indian people, and we, of course, I myself, I'm not an Indian expert. I like to clarify that. I haven't dug up any, Indian burial grounds and dusted the bones of my people. I haven't read any good books on Indian history, but I am 35 years old, and I lived as an Indian all my life. We knew that when we formed the American Indian Movement in July of 1968, the gross annual income of the American Indian nationally, this is based on 750,000 Indian people here in the United States registered under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the gross annual income of Indian people is set at $1,500 a year. We also found out through surveys and studies that were taken by this National Indian Task Force that Indian people, because of the public health services not being provided for them, either on a reservation setting and today in an urban setting, they have no insurance and etc. Because of the lack of public health services, Indian people live to be 43.5. Now, of course, white America is 65 plus. We have a suicidal rate 7 times the national average. 82% of Indian housing nationally, and this includes reservation and urban setting, 82% of Indian housing is substandard, considered substandard today. And 72% of that housing doesn't even have, running water. And if it does have running water, it's polluted or contaminated in some way. And finally, we as Indian people were not even made citizens in this country until 1924. Knowing that these conditions existed and exist right here in the city of Minneapolis, knowing that the dropout rate of Indian students in high schools is set at 65% nationally, 64.5 right here in Minneapolis, a young group of Indian Americans, Indian people got together in July of 1968, and they formed an organization that was first known as the Concerned Indian American Coalition. And because of the initials alone, we found out we had to change that, the CIA. And we became known as the American Indian Movement. At the time of our formation here in the city of Minneapolis, there was 22 other Indian organizations handling some type of program, information referral, Indian upward bound, stairs, etc. There's 22 different Indian organizations in this city, yet nothing was being done to create any type of social change in agencies or institutions that were supposed to be serving the American Indian. We knew that when we formed and coalesced together with other groups of Indians that were dissatisfied with other organizations, we knew at that time that nothing was being done in the area of providing legal services for Indian people. Nothing was being done about police harassment and police brutality. And these things do exist here in Minneapolis. So when we formed the American Indian Movement, we knew that we had to become a very vocal group of Indian people. We had to stand up. And it wasn't a civil rights type movement. This is another question that's continuously thrown at Indian people throughout the United States. Are you doing this today? Are you taking this federal surplus property? Did you take Alcatraz? Are you doing this, demonstrating against the church and etc. because of the civil rights movement, or because of Martin Luther King, or because of the Black Panthers and etc.? And the only answer I always have to that question is Indian people were demonstrating for a hell of a long time before Martin Luther King and before the Constitution was ever enacted in this country. And Indian people have been demonstrating to this system and to this society, and the high dropout rate, the suicidal rate, the housing conditions, and etc., all of their lives, or at least since the white man got here. It's often been stated by Indian people, especially those that are quite active, Indian speakers throughout the United States, that we as Indian people would probably be a hell of a lot better off today if Plymouth Rock landed on the Pilgrims instead of Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock. Because we know that these people that came here seeking religious freedom, came to America, to the New World, and discovered Indians, not America, discovered Indians because this white honky was something like 1,800 miles off his course, thought he landed in India, he called us Indians. We know that when they landed here, they were welcomed here. We know that when Christianity came here in full force with the coming of the Pilgrims, it was the Indian people who provided them, contributed everything that they had in the area of food, medicine, shelter, how to plant their crops, etc. 50% of the Pilgrims that landed at Plymouth Rock died that first year. And when they celebrated Thanksgiving, they weren't just thanking Jesus Christ or God for saving them. They were thanking God and Jesus Christ, their Savior, for providing them with the Indian people that came out and saved them. This spirit and this feeling is gone in America today. Today, Thanksgiving is just a day to sit down and eat turkey. It's extra day off from work, a day to celebrate. Everything is forgotten about the Indian and his contributions to this society and this system today. We don't read about this in American history. We don't read about the contributions that Indian people made. Fact is, Indian people contribute every damn thing that you have. Everything. And there's been doctors and scientists have stated over and over, time and time again, that they haven't come up with a medicine yet here in America that Indian people didn't have, use, and practice. Yet there's nothing mentioned about these contributions in school textbooks today. Perhaps this is why we have a 65% dropout rate. There's no identity for the Indian student. Education today is what it always has been. It's a white European concept of conquest and victory. This is all education is to the Indian, and this is the way the Indian sees it. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Christianity and what it's done to the Indian. After they welcomed the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, after they give them medicine, healed them, fed them, showed them how to plant their crops and how to build their houses, shelter, within 56 years after the Pilgrims landed, with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other, seeking religious freedom, 40 tribes, because they refused to become converted and be baptized and recognize this man that they hung on a cross as their Savior, man they never knew, never saw, that they hung themselves because Indian people would not accept that doctrine and their way of life. 40 tribes were totally erased from the face of the earth. It is stated that when Columbus landed here, the Pilgrims, years later, that there was well over 1 million Indian people here in North America. At the closure of the last battle fought in South Dakota, or the Wounded Knee Massacre, there was less than 250,000 left. This is Christianity. 10 commandments they came here with. Can you imagine the shock on Indian people's faces when they produced a white man hanging on a cross and said, "This man died for your sins"? Indian people never knew him. They had their own God, their own higher power. And the people that settled this continent, that came here, seeking that freedom, never let the Indian hold on to his freedom, hold on to his own religion, his own tradition, and his own culture. And this is why we have a so-called Indian problem in America today. And we refuse to call it an Indian problem. We know that Indian people didn't have problems like we have today. We didn't have 30 to 50% of the population in various institutions like the workhouse out here at Parker's Lake Indian. Fact is, we didn't have penal institutions. We didn't have old age homes. We didn't have adoption centers. We didn't have pollution, pesticides, LSD. And we didn't have syphilis and gonorrhea and diphtheria and smallpox either. So I'd like to know how in the hell they helped us, how they saved us, now that we live under the conditions that we live under today. Because none of these things are written about and studied in the educational process today, we have a 65% dropout rate. Because none of the great leaders of Indian people were ever recognized, we have a dropout rate today. Because Indian students are singled out when they are in a class as an Indian student, we have a dropout rate today and a suicidal rate 7 times the national average. When the American Indian movement formed in July of 1968, we decided to do something about that. To erase the stereotyped image of white America has of Indian people. It's been one long, hell of a battle, but we continue day after day to try to do that. We created a legal rights center here in Minneapolis. This came out of statistics that we gathered ourselves in regards to the Citizens Patrol and the stopping of the harassment and the paddy wagons and the squad cars from coming down and loading our people up, charging them not with public drunkenness or minor intoxication, but generally when an Indian got picked up here in Minneapolis, and it's still the same today, he was not only charged with public drunkenness or minor intoxication or breach of peace, they always charge with resisting arrest, using profanity in public, attempted assault, breach of peace, and etc. And when they got in court and had no money to defend themselves, they furnished a public defender for these Indian people and told them, you plead guilty to these 4 or 5 charges and we'll take you to court on just breach of peace alone. And they made these deals. They negotiated a plea. And the judges here in Hennepin County sent them right directly to the workhouse. 60, 90, 30 days, a year. No pre-sentence investigation at that time. No pre-sentence investigation. Never asked an Indian if he had a home, if he had a job, if he was married, if he had a family. So generally when he went to the workhouse, the family broke up, the wife went back to the reservation, the children went back, their education was broken down. And they said, well, Indian people are very unreliable. They keep running back and forth to the reservation. They didn't know that this system was forcing them back and forth, forcing them off the reservation because they were starving, and forcing them out of the cities because they could receive no justice here, no housing, no employment, etc. When we formed the American Indian movement, we knew that we were going to do something about that. We had become known as a very militant organization. But nobody knows about the things that the American Indian movement has done. Nobody knows about the Indian studies courses that have been instituted right here at the University of Minnesota in McAllister, several other small colleges in the state, other parts of the country. Nobody knows about the housing program that was created by AIM. Over 2,000 families were helped in 1 year. Nobody knows of the Legal Rights Center. They say it's militant to do these things. It's militant to stand up. It was militant to present 7 challenges to the American Lutheran Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in July of 1969. It was militant to call the Minnesota Council of Churches, Department of Indian Work together and tell them that if you're going to be a Department of Indian Work, we want 75% control of that board. It was militant to tell the churches, if you don't do this, we are going to expose what you have done to Indian people for the past 6 years. We're going to talk about the $4 million that you have solicited out of congregations throughout the state of Minnesota, using the Indian as your gimmick, using the Indian, the conditions that Indian people live under, to solicit that money. And we're going to talk about your Department of Indian Work, your all-white staff, white middle-class Protestant staff. And we're going to talk about the money that is allotted and budgeted for this department. No more than $39,000 a year ever went into that department. And only $1,300 actually filtered down to the 33,000 Indians that live in this state. And we don't know where the hell that went. But we do know that that department, those 4 people, used up to 6 months and 1 year in vacation time outside of Minnesota. So we immediately gained control of that department, and we established goals for the churches. And that's all we're merely asking as Indian people, were them to listen to us and open their ears and their eyes and live up to their own feelings, Christian feeling of brotherhood and love. That's all we're asking them to do. If you believe in this man so much, then get in his footsteps and do something about the poverty-stricken conditions of other people, people who have provided you with everything that you have today. We found out they did this on a national level. 6 months later, we found ourselves in Sioux Falls. The American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church of America, and Lutheran Church Missouri Synod held a meeting every year in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, called the Lutheran Church and Indian People, where 264 ministers got together from these 3 synods and talked about the so-called Indian problem in America, their missions. They've been on about a 350-year mission, the churches with Indians. It's about damn time they complete that mission. They talked about priorities and budgets and how much money was going to be set aside for their own wages and etc. And the American Indian movement walked in there and presented that body with 7 basic challenges to give full control of all Indian missionary work and programming to a National Indian Lutheran Board. And the resolutions were voted on and passed. We held a podium for 3 solid days at that meeting, changed the whole agenda. They were voted on, passed on, and what got time to institute this program that we set up for them, they backed down. So last year we had a demonstration. We took over the college at Augustana dormitory. And we charged the Lutheran Church at that time. We had attorneys. And we were going to file a $1 billion lawsuit. And they thought we were joking. $4 million for gross violations of the 10 Commandments. Another $4 million for alienation of ecumenical affections. And the remaining $2 million to cover court costs and attorney fees. And this is exactly what the churches have done. It's been a gross violation of the commandments that they came here and told Indian people that they had to live under. Thou shalt not steal. Every damn thing that they have today, they have stolen, one way or the other, from Indian people through treaties. Thou shalt not kill. And there are 56 tribes today that are totally erased from the face of the earth. And after giving us, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife nor his goods, they had people like Shevington of the Methodists. He led the charge at Sand Creek. Slaughtered those 480 men, women, and children. And after giving us all of these commandments and telling this is what we must do, commandments that Indian people never needed, they set aside only 1 day to observe them. Only 1 day. They didn't realize and understand that Indian people's religion was on a 24-hour-a-day business with us. That the earth was our mother. The earth was our mother, and we believe that anything that we took out, we must put back. We didn't have pollution. We didn't rape our mother. We didn't pollute her. We didn't do any of these things. Yet they came along and told us this is what you have to live by. And look at the conditions in this country today, the violations of those commandments that they came here, and that doctrine, Christianity. And then when they couldn't, when Indian people started resisting and started demonstrating and started fighting because they knew that they were going to lose everything that they had, and if it wasn't for Joseph, Crazy Horse, Gall, Sitting Bull, Tecumseh, Hole in the Day, Crashing Thunder, if it wasn't for these great chiefs and great leaders who fought for our survival, we Indian people would not be here today. We would not be here today. And we feel as a movement today that we owe something in honor of these great leaders that are never recognized in your history books. We feel that we owe them something. And we are going to carry out their way of life, what they believed was right and what was wrong for their people. We must do that today. Then they came along 149 years ago and established a Bureau of Indian Affairs. A Bureau of Indian Affairs. White people and black people should be going up to that goddamn Bureau of Indian Affairs today and charging them with discrimination if they refuse them service. Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs ain't doing a damn thing for Indian people. And if you've been reading the paper, you'd understand that there's a major shakeup taking place today. And this came out of what considered militant actions were. The American Indian movement taking over 9 area offices in the United States and closing them for 1 solid week. Demanding that young people, activists, be placed in power positions within the Interior Department in Washington, D.C. 4 months after we demanded these things, these challenges, we made these challenges known to the President of the United States. They did hire 16 young Indian activists. And the Bureau, all the Indian people throughout the nation, tribal leaders, coalitions, urban Indian groups, national Indian youth councils, all felt that something was going to change. This 150 years of bureaucracy that they lived under was finally going to change. They established the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the War Department to regulate trade between the Indians and the settlers. Today, we're under land management in the Interior Department. They're still only concerned about that less than 1/2 or 1% of the land that Indian people still own today. They're still concerned about that land because it isn't polluted. It isn't shit on yet. And they're after it. They're after it. We're fighting every day to try to get it back. The demonstration that took place in Wisconsin is mentioned in the morning paper. There's a bill being introduced to turn those 16,000 acres back to the Chippewa Indians in Wisconsin. Northern States Power robbed the Indians of those 16,000 acres more than 50 years ago. Legal theft. Over 3,000 voting members of that tribe in the state of Wisconsin, only 108 agreed to the lease with Northern States Power. And when they flooded, they were only supposed to flood 224 acres as a backup to the power plants that NSP and the Wisconsin Light Company were putting in there. But when they got through, they had flooded over 16,000 acres of land. They agreed to build new homes for the Indians as part of the lease. There are still no new homes in this Wisconsin Chippewa tribe. They agreed to remove the burial ground. Today, all those graves where all the great leadership of the Wisconsin Chippewa tribe are underwater. They agreed that all of the timber that was cut down and cleared, the money would be turned over to the tribe. Not 1 penny of that money did NSP turn over to the tribe. So when that lease expired, In August, 6th of August, we were there and we took over that dam. We had the whole state of Wisconsin shook up. People were calling the National Guard, get those Indians off there. Everybody downstream. We really had power there. 16,000 acres of water behind us. And the governor was flying. And he couldn't understand why Indian people had to take over a dam to have their grievances heard in this country today. Couldn't understand why we had to take that dam over to talk about the conditions of the Wisconsin Chippewa tribe. So we know, as a movement, and as Indian people, that we have to be just as militant as Crazy Horse, Gall, and the other great chiefs that I mentioned. We know that nothing is going to change in this country until people stand up and say that it is wrong and are able to show that it's wrong and to come back with a program that's going to correct that wrong. But we also know as Indian people that we ourselves are not going to be able to do that. It's going to take people like you, young people. I don't know how many of you heard George McGovern here the other night. He was talking the same story, I guess. We bank on that, young people today, of changing some of these conditions, or at least supporting some type of legislation, supporting maybe various demonstrations, helping to establish the all-Indian school concept that the American Indian movement is proposing at the present time. We know that these conditions are not going to change until we can demonstrate to the public that we as Indian people can change them ourselves if given the support. In 1935, one of the greatest religious holy men that ever lived died. This man couldn't speak a word of English, never been to school. He died on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, full-blooded Okalala Sioux. The Sioux people and the Chippewa and the Hopi, the prophecies are all the same. The religion was universal, even though they had different dialects, different ways. They worshiped one great spirit chief. The Sioux people knew in their particular prophecy, long before the white man got here, that they were coming. I attend Uweepi ceremonies and sweat lodges on the Rosebud Indian Reservation today because the religion here in this state is quite dead. It's coming back throughout the country, but here in Minnesota it is dead. We're trying to get it going again. We know Indian people need that. On the Rosebud Reservation, I attend Uweepi ceremonies. It's the only religion in the world that I know of today where they recognize the four colors of the earth. That whenever they set up their altar, there's a white flag there, a red flag, a yellow flag, and a black flag. And when they take that peace pipe and they offer it to the four directions, they're also honoring the four races of man, the four colors. This man that died in 1935 knew, and the Sioux people knew, long before Columbus ever landed here, that they were coming. Talked about two comings of the white man. The first, they would stay for just a very short period and leave. The Vikings. Then they said it would be a second coming. And their skin would be so pale, so white. The Indian people said, white as death. In the prophecy, white as death. And they said that they would never leave. And the talk that the Indian would save them, would come out and minister to them. And when they were dying at Plymouth Rock, Indian people did come out and save them. Furnished them everything that they had. Then they said that the Indian would suffer for generations. They talked about conditions that would exist in this day and this time. The prophecy is up to date today. They said that the deer and the antelope would run and hide. You know what's happened here in the state of Minnesota. They're not even allowed deer hunting this season. The buffalo would disappear before our very eyes. They are gone. They talked about the two-legged, the animals leaving, hiding. Then they talked about the eagle, the greatest religious symbol universally of all Indian people. They talked about the eagle being attacked by this society. And you know what has happened in Wyoming and Utah, and what will happen again in Alaska when they set off that atomic blast up there to the eagles. But they said conditions would be so bad. They talked about a black cloud would cover Mother Earth. There'd be rioting and looting and burning. That would come to pass. They knew that the white people would set up churches. They'd box Christ in churches, God. And that there'd be splits between the denominations. There'd be splits from the higher schools of learning. There'd be dropouts. They didn't call them hippies and yippies. They did talk about the dissension in this country and the prophecy. And then they said that even the Creator, the giver of life, of all things, the sun, would someday be unable to see the fish in the water. Pollution, they knew about it. It was prophesied. And when all of these things came about in this generation, it was stated that little fires would burn again. That when conditions were so poor and so bad, almost the same conditions that white America faced at Plymouth Rock, they said that little fires would burn again. That Indian people would stand up. They didn't say that Indian people would inherit the earth, because we never owned it. We shared everything that we had. It was the government that came in with their treaties and divided the land and the people. They made 389 of them. And as I stand here today, every one of those treaties are being violated. Yet they are honoring a treaty to fight a war in Vietnam. And we're saying they should get the hell out of Vietnam and come home and start honoring some of these treaties here. But they said when these conditions were that way, same as they were on Plymouth Rock, Indian people would stand up again. Little fires would burn. And we'd offer the same direction. We'd help save Mother Earth. And we sincerely believe today, since our formation in July of 1968, we are holding a national convention this month here in Minneapolis. We have 17 chapters today, considered one of the fastest growing movements in the country today. 17 chapters are meeting here to put together a national board, a national program, philosophy, to try to do something about the problems that man faces today. Problems that have been created for the Indian, problems that he never had. And we sincerely feel today, even though we are considered a very militant organization, even though Indian people are still considered a bunch of drunks, lazy, dumb, we sincerely believe today that the American Indian movement is no different than the Ghost Dance Society or the Sundance, the religious movements that formed in the late 1800s for survival. We sincerely believe today that the American Indian movement is those little fires that would burn again. Thank you.
Question around for a little while. I'll tell you the convo time is officially over at 10:40. I wonder if you can hang around for a few questions. Other people have to go.
I have a suggested reading list here. The book that I mentioned, is the man I was talking about, of course, is Black Elk. This book was published in 1935 by John Nyhart, who spent 2 years with Black Elk on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation prior to his death. Black Elk, of course, was one of the first medicine men or religious holy men of the Indian people that ever put his story down on paper. And the reason why he did it is he felt that not only his own Indian people had to know these things, but someday maybe white people would stand up and listen also. This book has recently is fast becoming a bestseller in colleges and universities throughout the country today. We have a suggested reading list. One of the best books out that I feel today is the book that's on the top of the bestseller list right here in Minneapolis, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It is written by a white man, but it's written by a white man that really understands Indian culture and religion and tradition. And it's an authentic account of the winning of the West from the Indian point of view. What Indian people witnessed is taken out a lot of the text and information there is taken out of congressional records. So it's telling the truth. And we don't necessarily talk about Indian study programs. You know, I don't believe that an Indian should have to go to college to learn to be an Indian. You know, I think this is something we need from Head Start all the way on. What we are saying is, you know, that as far as this busing issue is concerned, this isn't new to the Indian either. They've been busing Indian people from Alaska to Chillicothe, Oklahoma. They've been busing Indians from here to Haskell, Kansas, Carlisle, and 226 all-Indian schools, boarding schools in the country today. But yet every one of these schools are governed and controlled by an all-white school board. There's only two Indian schools in the country that are run by Indian people and has an Indian curriculum, and that's Rough Rock Demonstration School and the Pine Point School on the White Earth Indian Reservation in this state. The American Indian Movement hopes to start the same thing.
I think we'll have to officially end the convocation at this point, but Mr. Bellecourt can be around for a little while. If any of you have questions you'd like to ask him, he'll stay around the auditorium for a little bit later. Thank you again very much, Mr. Bellecourt, for being with us.
Thank you.